Today we look at 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7. And it begins chapter 6 within the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. So for 40 years they had, wandered in the wilderness, and now evidently they've been 440 years roughly in the promised land. And in all that time, it was, Solomon was king for Saul was king for a little bit, and David was king for 40 years, and now we are in the reign of Solomon. So, those other years they had been, God, of course, was their leader, and they had judges, people that were, watching out and looking over, and prophets that way. But so they had been becoming established, and King David had been, thinking he should build a temple for God, but God said, no, your son will do that. And so we have the beginning of the construction, the beginning and the end in chapter 6 of the construction of the temple. And it, says the house that King Solomon built for the Lord. It's, and I guess we don't really, I don't think of a church as a house for God. We think about, sometimes it's called God's house, but we know that God is much more than that. And that was why God didn't want the temple built really either, because he said, I don't live in a temple. But anyway, it was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. And so a cubit is about 18 inches. So 60 cubits, that's, 90 feet, or I don't know what it is, but it's a big building. And it talks about how the house is made with windows with recessed frames. And so, the windows were, set back in a little bit. So there was a window, and all of this pretty detailed. But then verse 6 kind of puzzles me. It says the lowest story was 5 cubits. The second story was 6 cubits, and the third story was 7 cubits. So it got bigger as it went up, and to me, that just seems backwards. But I read it a couple of times, and that's what it says. But that's, it is what it is. So they built it, it says, with stone that was finished at the quarry. So there wasn't the banging and the chipping, it was silent at the construction site. Well, not completely silent, but there wasn't that hammering. And I think too about like the Egyptian pyramids, how those are built, and, how people have determined, how was it that those people moved those huge stones that way? And I think about in Jesus' day, as Jesus and his disciples were sitting there, and the disciples commented on the beauty of the temple and the magnificent, massive stones that were there, and the sheer physical labor that took place there. But and I wish that I had a mind that I could keep track of all this and then see the picture. But there's so many different details, the entrance for the story was on the south side with winding upstairs. I can picture a winding stairway, but, he built the house and finished it, with beams and cedar planks, and he built the structure against the house. So there were, different rooms and stuff. And I struggle with picturing all of this. But in verse 11, it says, the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house. If you walk according to my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep my commandments, I will establish my promise with you. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and I will not forsake my people. And we know that Solomon did that for a while, sort of. But he built the walls. And, in verse 14, he says he built the house and he finished it. And then he lines the walls. Then the floors and the walls are, gold plated and fancy ornate artwork. And then, this part was built, and then he covered the floor with boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits on the rear of the house with cedar. So, you get the part done, and then you're continuing to do more. And the house, the nave in the front of the sanctuary was 40 cubits long, and the cedar in the house was all of that. And then the inner sanctuary, and the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, it says, was a cube, 30 cubits, a square room, and 30 cubits by 30 cubits. So You know, and you know, this is a fairly sizable building, you know, that way. And but it is what God had told them to make. And then, you know, talking about the interior of the sanctuary was, you know, this size, and he overlaid the altar with cedar, and then he overlaid the inside with pure gold. And I'm thinking, my goodness, that's a lot of gold to line the walls and the floor. And, you know, and it's kind of the picture we sometimes hear about of, you know, this person trying to want to take the gold along to heaven, you know, to have this valuable metal up there, and then get to heaven and have it, everything is paved with gold, you know, and well, what do you want to bring that common, ordinary stuff along, you know? And so it's differences of perspective in some ways, but it was, anyway, it was a very fancy temple that was being built for God. The inner sanctuary, you know, 2 cherubim of olive wood, you know, 10 cubits high, and so that's, you know, 180 inches, 15 feet tall, you know, and you know, he put them in there so their wings reached out and stretched the walls, and, you know, and all of the imagery that's here is, you know, really very detailed in its explanation. And then we get to the end of chapter 6, verse 37, in the 4th year the foundation was laid. So, you know, it took them a while to get started. And then in the 11th year it was completed. So it was 7 years in building the temple for God. And then chapter 7 begins with, it took Solomon 13 years to build his own house. So almost twice as long to build his own house as, you know, the house of Solomon is, of course, the palace. And not to say that make that the temple make that less or anything, but the palace was where all of the functions of the king and the royal court and the government was to take place. And this was 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide. So, you know, quite a bit bigger than the 60 cubits by 30 cubits, or what the temple was. And it was roofed with cedar on the 45 rafters, 15 in each row, you know, were on the pillars. And again, you know, very detailed explanation of the building. The doorways and doorposts had 4-sided frames opposing each other. He made the hall of pillars and the hall of the throne. And then verse 8, he made his own house where he would reside on the court in the back. And he made a house like it for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as a wife. So he had his house, and Pharaoh's daughter had her house, and how many other houses and everything were a part of the temple, you know, the palace, the palace that way. And again, this was all made of costly stone, cut according to measure, sawed with saws, back and forth from the foundation of the coping. And I'm thinking, cut from stone, sawed back and forth. I mean, you think about, I don't have a saw in my shop that I would like to use to cut stone, although there are some diamond tipped stones, car saws and stuff that are made for cutting stone and cutting glass. But, you know, the image of cutting saws back and forth, cutting stone, is just kind of a foreign picture to me. I can picture a buck saw going back and forth, you know, through a log. I mean, I used that, you know, out at our cabin many different times. We cut wood with a buck saw going back and forth, so I can picture it, but it just doesn't make sense that you're cutting stone that way. And then the house is getting completed, and King Solomon invites Hiram from Tyre, you know, this land up north there, a skilled man who comes, and most of the rest of chapter 7 is talking about how this Hiram casts the bronze and casts all of the different fixings and the ornate works within the palace, you know, in Solomon's house that way. You know, verse 40, so Hiram made the pots, the shovels, the basins, and he finished all the work that he did for the king. And when I read that again about Hiram making the pots in the temple, you know, it said that there was, you know, in verse 15, you know, he lined the walls of the house. There not was Yeah, it wasn't there, but he built this cistern, this that was 10 cubits wide, but the line around it was 13 cubits. In my mind, that doesn't compute, but it said it held roughly 12,000 gallons of water, and it was 10 feet off the ground. But yet, supposedly, the priests used it to wash. And there was another basin that held the water equivalent to 240 gallons, and just huge things that they were building and having in there. And it just, in my mind, it's just wow. And that's, what more can you say? But building a temple for God and a palace for the king, I mean, you expect it to be pretty fancy stuff.